My name is Elwayne Drelin, and what I'm about to share still feels like a bad dream. Imagine building a home with your partner, pouring every ounce of effort into it, only to have the very people who should support you treat you like an intruder. One evening, my wife's parents decided they had the right to erase me from my own life. They called the police, insisting I was trespassing in what they claimed was their house. The humiliation, the disbelief, the sting of betrayal, it all came crashing down as flashing lights filled the driveway. But here's the twist. The deed, the very proof of ownership, carried only one name: mine. This is not just a story about a house. It's about dignity, about finding the courage to stand your ground when even family tries to cast you aside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flashing blue and red lights against the quiet street felt surreal. Elwayne Drelin stood in the cool evening air, arms crossed against the chill, trying to steady his breath. What unsettled him wasn't just the arrival of two police cruisers. It was the way his in-laws, Orlisse Branvel and Garrick Branvel, stood on the front porch like victors who had already claimed the prize. They whispered to each other in sharp tones, throwing quick glances his way as though he were a stranger trespassing on sacred ground. The house loomed behind them, its windows glowing a soft amber. Elwayne remembered the years he had dreamed of this very home, the countless late nights spent sketching plans, budgeting, and fighting through doubt to make it real. Every board, every fixture, every corner had passed under his hands or his supervision. And yet, tonight, with uniformed officers stepping out of their cars, the man who built it was being told he didn't belong. "Sir, we got a call about a domestic dispute," one of the officers said as he approached. His partner lingered by the cruiser, already scribbling on a notepad. "We were informed you were refusing to leave this property after being asked to." Elwayne inhaled slowly, aware of the Branvels watching eagerly. Their daughter, his wife Lunara Feldrin, wasn't even visible. That stung more than he wanted to admit. Where was she? Hiding inside with them? Avoiding the scene? Or simply paralyzed by fear of confrontation? "Officer," Elwayne began, voice calm but steady, "I need you to understand something right away. This house is mine. I bought it, I renovated it, and I hold the deed. No one can tell me to leave my own home." A chuckle rolled off Garrick's tongue, smug and venomous. "That's rich, Elwayne. You wouldn't even have this place if not for us. We've been paying bills, supporting Lunara, doing everything you couldn't. You're a guest here at best, and an ungrateful intruder at worst." The words dug deep, but Elwayne refused to flinch. He had lived long enough under Garrick's belittlement, through veiled insults at family dinners and backhanded comments about his career. He knew this man thrived on provoking weakness. Tonight, he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Why don't you show them proof?" Orlisse chimed in, her voice deceptively sweet. "If you really own this house, where's the paperwork? Where's the evidence? All we see is a man standing outside while his wife is inside, terrified." It was a masterful lie. The officer's eyes flickered with the weight of uncertainty. Without hesitation, Elwayne pulled a leather folder from the satchel he had been carrying since leaving work. Inside were neatly organized documents, insurance papers, mortgage receipts, utility bills, and most importantly, the deed with his name written in bold, irrefutable ink. He handed it over to the officer without a word. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Garrick's smirk faltered, Orlisse's eyes darted nervously, and even the officers exchanged a look that said more than words could manage. Still, appearances carried weight. "Mr. Drelin," the officer said carefully, "this does appear to show you as the sole owner of the property. Would you be able to explain why your wife's parents called us here tonight?" Elwayne glanced at the Branvels, who now shifted uncomfortably on the porch. He could have unloaded his frustrations right then. Every manipulative tactic, every insult, every effort they had made to wedge themselves between him and Lunara. But anger wasn't the weapon tonight. The truth was enough. "They believe they can control this house because they've tried to control everything else," he said simply. "But this is my home. I will not be erased from it no matter what story they try to spin." The words lingered like smoke in the cool night air. And though the officers eventually returned his documents with quiet nods, Elwayne knew this was only the opening move. Because tonight was no accident, it was a test. The Branvels weren't just trying to remove him from his house. They were trying to erase his identity, his place in the family, his very sense of belonging. And that battle, he realized, had been building for far longer than this one night. He thought back to the first time he met them, years earlier. Lunara had introduced him at a cafe near the city's old stone clock tower. Garrick's handshake had been firm, almost crushing, and Orlisse's smile had looked painted on rather than born from warmth. From the start, they had treated him not as a partner for their daughter, but as an obstacle, a challenge to their authority. Every conversation with them had been a test of worthiness. What do you earn? Where do you live? How will you provide? Even when Elwayne secured his promotion at the architectural firm, even when he and Lunara moved forward with plans to settle down, the Branvels always found a way to twist success into insufficiency. So perhaps it was inevitable that this house, this symbol of independence, would become the battlefield. Still, he had never imagined they would go so far as to summon police under false pretenses, dragging his name into public humiliation. That, more than anything, revealed the depth of their desperation. As the officers wrapped up their visit, reminding all parties to resolve the matter peacefully, Garrick and Orlisse slunk back into the house without so much as an apology. The front door slammed, shutting them inside with Lunara. For a long moment, Elwayne remained outside, staring at the quiet facade of the home he had poured so much into. This was no longer just about in-laws meddling. It was about respect. It was about dignity. And as much as it pained him to admit, it was about Lunara too, because her silence in that moment spoke volumes. The night settled heavy on his shoulders as he finally stepped back inside. His home felt divided, not by walls, but by loyalties. The war had only just begun, and though the deed might have his name on it, the fight for peace inside those walls was far from won. The first weeks in the new house were supposed to be golden. Elwayne Drelin still remembered walking through the entryway for the first time, Lunara's hand clutching his as they crossed the threshold. The smell of fresh varnish clung to the stair rails, and the faint scent of paint lingered on the walls. The sunlight filtered in through wide glass windows, spilling across the polished oak floors in gentle waves. "This is it," Lunara had whispered, her voice trembling between excitement and disbelief. "Our home." He had smiled then, a rare, unguarded grin breaking across his face. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or overflowing words, but in that moment, he felt something deep settle in his chest, something that whispered permanence. They spent weeks turning the house into more than wood and plaster. Together they painted rooms, choosing colors that reflected pieces of their lives. Soft sage green in the kitchen because Lunara said it reminded her of spring mornings. Deep cobalt in the study because Elwayne needed a space that felt grounded, a place for focus. At night, they lay on the living room floor surrounded by empty pizza boxes and laughter, too exhausted to move, but unwilling to leave the glow of what they had built together. The house became their canvas, their story written in color and light. But shadows don't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they slip in through the smallest cracks. It began with Orlisse Branvel's suggestions. At first, they seemed harmless enough. "You should really go with velvet drapes in the dining room," she said one afternoon while visiting. "It'll make the space feel more sophisticated, especially when you host dinners. Not those cotton ones you picked. They're too casual." Or when she trailed her manicured fingers along the countertops and remarked, "Granite is durable, yes, but quartz would have been the smarter choice, easier to maintain. It's what real families choose." Real families. The phrase stuck like a thorn. Garrick, meanwhile, made his presence known through silence, sharpened into weapons. He never outright criticized, but his pauses, those heavy, deliberate pauses, after Elwayne spoke, carried more judgment than words ever could. If Elwayne mentioned a project at the architectural firm, Garrick's lips would press into a thin line, as though biting back a comment about wasted effort. If Elwayne suggested a plan for the backyard garden, Garrick's raised brow would silently question whether he had the skill. They were small things, easy to dismiss in isolation, but like drops of water carving stone, they wore away at the edges of peace. Lunara felt it too, though she tried to soften the blows. "They just have their way of showing love," she'd tell him as they sat together in the kitchen after her parents left. She'd reach across the table, brushing her fingers over his knuckles. "I know it's intense, but they mean well. You know how they are." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the warmth they had created within these walls, and for a time he managed. He poured himself into his work at the firm, into designing community spaces that would outlast him, into nurturing the small garden that began to bloom in the backyard. But every season seemed to bring new encroachments. The Branvels began stopping by unannounced. At first once a week, then every other day, until it became difficult for Elwayne and Lunara to enjoy a quiet evening alone. They'd arrive with bags of groceries or gifts for the house, sweeping into the space with the air of people who owned it. "This living room really needs a better layout," Orlisse declared one Saturday as she shifted furniture without asking. "Your sofa should face the window." "Trust me, I've been managing households for decades." Garrick didn't bother asking before mowing the lawn, muttering about how Elwayne never got around to it. His footprints left muddy tracks across the deck, and when Elwayne mentioned it, Garrick only smirked. "If you did it right the first time, you wouldn't have to complain about how I fix it." Elwayne clenched his jaw, choosing silence over sparks. But silence, he began to realize, was its own kind of surrender. One evening, after a long day at work, Elwayne returned home to find Orlisse rearranging the cabinets. Lunara stood nearby, wringing her hands, clearly uncomfortable. "Why is everything so disorganized?" Orlisse demanded, pulling jars from the shelves. "You'll never keep a proper home like this." "Lunara, dear, you should have told me sooner. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Elwayne set his briefcase down a little harder than intended. "This is our kitchen, Orlisse. We'll decide how to arrange it." The air froze. Lunara looked at him with wide eyes, silently begging him not to escalate. Orlisse's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Well," she said finally, "some men don't know how to appreciate help when it's offered." Help. That was the word she always used, though it felt less like assistance and more like invasion. That night, as they lay in bed, Lunara turned to him whispering, "Please don't fight with them. It'll just make things worse." He stared at the ceiling, the shadows of tree branches swaying across the plaster. "Worse for who?" he asked softly. She didn't answer. The tension thickened when Garrick and Orlisse began hinting at finances. They'd casually mentioned the gifts they'd given the couple, funds for furniture, contributions for small projects, and imply that those gestures gave them a stake in the house. "You wouldn't even have half of this without us," Garrick said one evening, sipping from a tumbler of scotch at the dining table. "Don't forget who's been keeping things afloat when you fall short." Elwayne's hand tightened around his fork. He wanted to remind Garrick that his career paid the mortgage, that his long hours at the firm were what kept the lights on. But the words lodged in his throat, trapped by the fear of turning dinner into a battlefield. Instead, he swallowed the bitterness and forced a smile. But something inside him shifted that night, a small crack in the dam of patience. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon. Elwayne returned from running errands to find the Branvels hosting guests in his backyard. A barbecue blazed, smoke curling into the sky. Tables had been set with food, chairs arranged, music drifting across the lawn. Children darted between adults, laughter rising into the air. But none of it was his doing. He stood frozen at the gate, grocery bags hanging limp in his hands, watching strangers occupy the space he had worked so hard to cultivate. Garrick spotted him first, lifting his glass in mock cheer. "Elwayne," he boomed, as though greeting an old friend. "Glad you could make it to the party. Grab a plate, there's plenty of food." Elwayne's jaw tightened. "What is this?" "Just a little gathering," Orlisse said smoothly, approaching with a practiced smile. "Lunara wanted us to invite some family friends. You don't mind, do you?" He looked past her to Lunara, who stood near the grill, wringing her hands again. Her eyes darted to his, apologetic, pleading. Something in his chest twisted. This wasn't just meddling anymore. It was ownership. They were using his home as their stage, parading their influence, reducing him to an outsider in his own life. He set the grocery bags down slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving Orlisse's. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do mind." The music faltered as a few heads turned, a silence stretched, fragile as glass. Garrick's smirk returned, sharp as a blade. "Careful, son. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself in front of company." But Elwayne knew in that moment that embarrassment was no longer the enemy, erasure was. And if he didn't take a stand soon, there would be nothing left of him in this house at all. The weeks following the backyard incident blurred into a haze of tension. Every time Elwayne walked through his own front door, he felt the walls pressing in, thick with voices that weren't his. The Branvels had a way of filling every room, not with warmth, but with presence, commanding, suffocating, undeniable. It wasn't long before their intrusion spilled into the public eye. It began with the dinner at the Glass Orchid, one of the city's most refined restaurants. Lunara had insisted on the gathering, hoping to smooth over what she called misunderstandings. She wore a pale lavender dress that night, her hair tied back in a loose braid, her smile soft but strained. Elwayne could see the effort she poured into keeping peace, and part of him wanted to indulge her hope. The Branvels arrived in a flourish. Orlisse, draped in a shimmering shawl, greeted the maitre d' as though she owned the establishment. Garrick shook hands with other diners, exuding the confidence of a man who believed the world tilted in his favor. As they all settled into their seats, menus spread before them, Garrick wasted no time seizing control of the evening. "You know," he announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to overhear, "it's been such a challenge helping these two manage that house. So many things to take care of, so many responsibilities they didn't expect." He chuckled, lifting his glass in mock toast. "But what are parents for, right?" The table erupted in polite laughter, except for Elwayne, whose jaw tightened as heat crept up his neck. Orlisse leaned closer to Lunara, her voice a conspiratorial whisper but just loud enough for Elwayne to catch. "If it weren't for us, dear, you'd be living in a cramped apartment somewhere, barely scraping by. This house gives you stature. Don't forget who made it possible." Lunara's smile wavered, her eyes darting toward Elwayne, but she said nothing. The humiliation pressed harder when Garrick ordered for the entire table without asking preferences. "Trust me," he declared, "Elwayne doesn't have much of a palate. He's fine with whatever. Let's do something refined for the rest of us." The sting wasn't in the words alone, but in the nods of agreement from the others, in the way the waiter glanced at Elwayne with faint pity. He tried to swallow the bitterness with water, but it sat like a stone in his chest. The evening spiraled further when Garrick pulled out his phone mid-meal, showing off photos of the house, his house, to acquaintances who had stopped by the table. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" Garrick said, swiping through images of the newly decorated living room and manicured lawn. "Took a lot of effort, a lot of investment, but it's worth it. Nothing compares to owning a piece of legacy." The acquaintances nodded approvingly, congratulating him on such a fine home. Not once did Garrick mention Elwayne's role, his sacrifices, his countless hours of work. Instead, when one of them asked, "So who holds the deed?" Garrick laughed, a calculated, dismissive sound. "Let's just say the family does. Paperwork is technical, what matters is who truly maintains it." Elwayne's knuckles whitened under the table. For a moment he considered slamming his glass down, correcting the lie with sharp, undeniable truth. But when he looked at Lunara, her pleading eyes begged him not to make a scene. So he stayed silent. And in that silence, humiliation carved itself deeper. But public dinners weren't the worst. The true breaking point came weeks later, at the community gathering in Willow Square, a vibrant open-air market held every month where neighbors showcased art, food, and music. Lunara had convinced Elwayne to attend, promising it would be fun, a chance to breathe outside the suffocating shadow of home. They wandered between stalls, sampling candied nuts and admiring hand-woven baskets. For the first time in weeks, Elwayne felt lightness returning. Until Garrick and Orlisse appeared, flanked by friends and acquaintances from their social circle. "Elwayne!" Orlisse exclaimed, her voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. There you are, we were just telling everyone about the house project. The group turned, curious eyes fixing on him. Garrick clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder, grinning wide. This man's lucky, I'll tell you that, Garrick boomed. Most people his age couldn't dream of affording a place like that. But with our help, he managed. Took a lot of guidance and, well, let's just say a good deal of funding. The words landed like blows, each one stripping away his dignity in front of strangers. The group nodded, murmuring admiration, not for him, but for the Branvels, who basked in stolen credit. Orlisse chimed in, shaking her head with theatrical fondness. He still struggles with the upkeep, of course. Doesn't always know what he's doing, poor thing. But we step in where we can. It's what family does. Laughter rippled through the group. Not cruel, perhaps, but patronizing enough to burn. Elwayne felt heat rise to his face, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. He glanced at Lunara, hoping for support, but she looked down at her shoes, cheeks flushed with shame or fear. It was hard to tell. The humiliation was complete. He wasn't just minimized. He was erased. A spectator in his own life, his accomplishments repackaged as favors from those who sought to dominate him. That night, as they walked home in silence, the weight between them grew unbearable. Finally, Elwayne stopped under the street lamp, the glow casting long shadows on the pavement. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice low but raw. Lunara flinched. "I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I thought it would only make things worse if we argued in public." He stared at her, the ache in his chest deepening. "Embarrass who? Them or me?" She didn't answer. The silence was louder than any words. From then on, every interaction with the Branvels carried the sting of that humiliation. When Garrick rearranged the garage, muttering about fixing mistakes, Elwayne said nothing. When Orlisse criticized the garden, suggesting it looked amateur, he bit his tongue. But inside, something was shifting. The humiliation wasn't just pain, it was a mirror. It showed him how far he had bent to avoid conflict, how often he had swallowed his own voice to preserve fragile peace. And in that reflection, he saw the dangerous path ahead. A life lived as a shadow in his own home, erased by the very people who should have respected him. It was in that crucible of humiliation that resolve began to spark. Because sometimes, being broken down is what teaches you how much you truly have to fight for. Nights became the hardest. By day, Elwayne could bury himself in the structure of work, the clean lines of blueprints, the rationality of calculations, the comfort of logic. But when the sun slipped behind the horizon and shadows stretched across the house, there was no blueprint for silence. No calculation to explain the way tension weighed against the walls. He often found himself awake long after Lunara drifted to sleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen below. The bed, once a place of closeness, had become an island. He lay on one side, rigid and still, while Lunara curled on the other, her breath slow and steady. Sometimes she reached for him in her sleep, her hand brushing his shoulder, but even then he couldn't relax. The distance between them was no longer measured in inches, but in unspoken words. It was on one of those nights, restless and heavy-eyed, that Elwayne slipped from bed and wandered to the backyard. The garden, dimly lit by the street lamp that bled over the fence, looked weary. The lavender he had planted months ago sagged under the weight of neglect, weeds pushing through the soil in defiance. The stone path he had laid by hand was uneven now, the Branvels having shifted decorations without care. It should have been a sanctuary, but instead it bore the scars of intrusion. He sank into the wooden bench at the edge of the yard, pressing his palms together, head bowed. How did it come to this? When he bought the house, he had imagined building not just walls but a future, a place where laughter echoed freely, where every corner carried meaning. Instead, it had become a battleground. His dignity was eroded one remark at a time, his authority dissolved with every intrusion. And the worst part, the part that hollowed him out, was Lunara's silence. He had married her not just for love, but for the way she made the world lighter. She had once been the one to stand by him against doubt, to remind him of his worth when he faltered. But now she seemed paralyzed between loyalty to him and fear of her parents. And her silence, whether born of love or cowardice, left him stranded. The following weekend brought no reprieve. The Branvels appeared unannounced again, this time with paint samples in hand. "This color will brighten the dining room," Orlisse said, brushing swatches against the wall without asking. "Needs better insulation too," Garrick added, tapping on the plaster like a foreman inspecting faulty work. "We should call my guy to handle it. Elwayne won't know who to hire." They spoke as if he weren't standing right there, as though the walls answered only to them. Elwayne felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising, but he held it in, his silence becoming a mask. He retreated upstairs into the study, the only room they hadn't dared to touch. Closing the door behind him, he leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The study was his last refuge. Deep cobalt walls surrounded him, the shelves still lined with books arranged just the way he liked. His drafting table, covered with rolled plans, stood like an anchor. He lit the small desk lamp, its golden glow softening the edges of the room, and sank into the chair. For a long time, he sat there in stillness, tracing lines on blank paper without purpose. Not designs, not plans, just lines, straight, curved, intersecting. A quiet rebellion against the chaos outside that door. It was then that clarity began to creep in. "They treat me like a guest because I allow it." The thought startled him, sharp and uncomfortable. He wanted to push it away, to insist that their dominance left him no choice. But the longer he stared at the blank page, the truer it felt. Every silence he had chosen, every swallowed word, every concession, it had carved space for them to fill. His fear of conflict had become the soil where their arrogance grew. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it was reality. He pressed his pen harder against the paper, the line darkening into a groove. "If I don't take a stand, I'll lose everything, not just this house, but myself." The next morning, he tried to bridge the chasm with Lunara. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, coffee cooling between them. "Lunara," he began, his voice measured, "I can't keep living like this." She looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "Your parents?" he said firmly. "The constant interference, the way they treat me, I can't be erased in my own home." Her shoulders tensed, her eyes flicking away. "They just want to help." "No," he said, sharper than intended. "They want to control, and you let them." Her lips parted, then closed again. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, "I don't want to be in the middle." The words stung more than outright opposition. "You're not in the middle, Lunara," he replied quietly. "You're choosing. Every time you stay silent, you're choosing them over me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she pushed back her chair and left the room, her footsteps echoing up the stairs. Elwayne sat alone at the table, staring at the untouched coffee, the silence louder than any fight. Loneliness became his constant companion. Even when Lunara was near, the gulf between them grew wider. He threw himself into work, staying late at the firm, sketching designs that had nothing to do with their home. At least on paper, his lines held meaning. But every return to the house deepened his resolve. He began keeping documents close, the deed, mortgage papers, receipts, anything that proved his ownership, his investment. He tucked them into a locked drawer in the study, a quiet arsenal for a battle he knew was coming. Some nights, he rehearsed what he would say. Imagined standing before Garrick and Orlisse, voice steady, proof in hand. In those imagined confrontations, he didn't falter. He didn't bite his tongue. He reclaimed his place. The thought both terrified and invigorated him. One evening, as he stood at the window of his study, he saw his reflection superimposed over the darkened garden. His own eyes stared back at him, weary but burning with something new. "This is my house," he whispered aloud, testing the words. They felt foreign at first, brittle like glass. But when he repeated them, stronger this time, they took on weight. "This is my house." For the first time in months, he felt the faint stirrings of dignity returning. The reflection turned into action in small, deliberate steps. When Orlisse criticized the placement of a painting in the hallway, he moved it back after she left. When Garrick rearranged the garage, Elwayne returned it to his own system, muttering to himself, "Mine, not yours." They were minor acts, invisible to anyone else, but they gave him breath, a reminder that the house still carried his imprint. He began spending more hours in the study, drafting not just designs for clients, but sketches of his home, the way he wanted it to be. He drew the garden restored, the living room arranged as he envisioned, the walls free from unwanted colors. Each line was a reclamation, each page a promise. The Branvels hadn't won yet with every small act of defiance, he knew the inevitable loomed. The Branvels wouldn't retreat quietly, and Lunara, caught between them, would not shield him. The storm was coming. But unlike before, he no longer feared it. Humiliation had stripped him bare. Loneliness had carved him hollow. But in that emptiness, he had found something unshakable. The conviction that he could not, would not, surrender his home or his dignity. And when the storm finally broke, he would be ready to stand in it. It happened on a Saturday. The kind of day that should have been ordinary, sunlight spilling across the windows, the faint hum of a lawnmower from somewhere down the street, the smell of cut grass drifting in through the screen door. But ordinary had long since abandoned the Drelin household. Elwayne had spent the morning in the study, sorting through paperwork. The deed lay on the desk in its folder, the crisp black letters of his name glaring back at him. He traced a finger over the page, steadying himself with its certainty. Whatever the Branvels said, whatever stories they spun, this document was the truth. His anchor. From downstairs came the muffled thrum of voices. Orlisse's lilting tones, Garrick's deep grumble, Lunara's softer replies. He sighed, pushing his chair back. Another uninvited visit. Another performance in his own home. When he descended the stairs, the scene waiting for him set his jaw tight. Orlisse stood in the living room, measuring tape in hand, fluttering from wall to wall like a designer in the middle of a renovation. Garrick loomed nearby, clipboard under his arm, scribbling notes. Lunara sat stiffly on the couch, her eyes fixed on her lap, hands clenched. "What is this?" Elwayne demanded, his voice echoing sharper than intended. Orlisse glanced over her shoulder, unbothered. "We're planning improvements. This space could be so much more with the right touch. Garrick knows a contractor who can get started next week." "Excuse me?" Elwayne stepped further into the room. "This is not your project. This is my house." Garrick's laugh was low, dismissive. "Your house? You think a mortgage payment makes it yours? We've invested just as much, if not more. Without us, this place wouldn't stand." Lunara shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Elwayne's chest tightened. "I never asked for your control. I never gave you permission to take over. You don't own this home." "On the contrary," Orlisse said smoothly, folding her tape measure, "we've given more than you realize. And honestly, Elwayne, Lunara deserves better than to live under your thumb." That last line sliced deeper than the rest. His thumb? Him, the intruder, in his own sanctuary? His voice rose. "Enough. This ends now. You don't get to dictate how we live." The air thickened. Garrick stepped closer, towering over him, his presence a wall of intimidation. "You don't speak to my wife that way," Garrick growled. "And you don't tell us when to leave. This is Lunara's home, and by extension ours. You're the outsider here." The words were a match to dry tinder. "Elwayne!" Lunara's voice finally broke through, trembling. "Please, don't." But before she could finish, Orlisse's voice rang out, sharp as glass. "Enough of this nonsense. Garrick, call the police. Let them settle who belongs here." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Elwayne stared at her, disbelieving. "You're calling the police? In my home?" Orlisse's smile was cold. "We'll see what they think about your so-called ownership." Minutes stretched like hours as Garrick made the call. His voice was calm, deliberate, painting Elwayne as a belligerent trespasser refusing to leave their daughter's house. Lunara sat frozen, her face pale, torn between her husband and her parents. Elwayne's hands trembled, not from fear but from rage tightly coiled. The insult was beyond anything he had imagined. To be erased was one thing. To be criminalized in his own home was another. The wail of sirens shattered the silence, growing louder until red and blue lights strobed against the windows. Tires crunched on the driveway. Doors slammed. Heavy boots approached. Elwayne's pulse pounded as two officers stepped inside, their eyes sweeping the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" one asked. Garrick wasted no time. "This man refuses to leave. He's been causing trouble, harassing us. This is our daughter's house and he doesn't belong here." Elwayne opened his mouth, but Orlisse cut in smoothly, her voice dripping with false concern. "We've tried to reason with him, officers, but he's unstable. We need him removed before things escalate." The officers' eyes flicked toward Elwayne, cautious, assessing. One of them gestured. "Sir, can we step outside for a moment?" The cool air hit his face as they led him onto the porch. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers rippling across the street. Humiliation clawed at his chest. He could almost hear Garrick's smug grin behind him. "Sir," the officer began, "we've been told you're refusing to leave. Can you explain your side?" Elwayne's voice shook, not with weakness, but with restrained fury. "This is my house, mine. They don't live here. They come uninvited, they interfere, and now they're trying to paint me as the intruder." The officer exchanged a skeptical glance with his partner. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Elwayne inhaled sharply. "Proof, yes." He strode back inside, the officers following close behind. Garrick and Orlisse stood tall, confidence radiating. Lunara's hands were pressed to her mouth, eyes glistening. Without a word, Elwayne walked past them into the study. He pulled open the locked drawer, his fingers steady now, and retrieved the folder. When he returned, he placed the deed on the dining table with deliberate care. "Read it," he said, his voice steel. The officers leaned over the document, scanning the lines. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of paper. Then one of them straightened, clearing his throat. "It's in his name," the officer said flatly. "Sole ownership, this is his residence." The words rang like a verdict. Orlisse's face blanched, her composure cracking for the first time. Garrick's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist at his side. Elwayne's gaze met theirs, unflinching. "You tried to erase me, you tried to humiliate me, but you can't change the truth." The officer turned to the Branvels. "You'll need to leave the premises immediately. If you refuse, we'll have to consider it trespassing." The silence that followed was thick with defeat. Garrick opened his mouth to argue, but the officer's stern look cut him short. With a huff, he grabbed his clipboard and stormed toward the door. Orlisse followed, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her mask of elegance shattered. Lunara remained frozen on the couch, tears streaking her face. As the door slammed behind her parents, the house fell into stillness. Elwayne stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, the deed still on the table. The officers offered him a nod before departing, their boots heavy on the porch. The red and blue lights faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the refrigerator once more. For the first time in months, Elwayne felt the air shift, lighter, freer, though still heavy with the aftershocks of battle. He turned to Lunara, who finally raised her eyes to meet his. Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't think it would come to this." His reply was quiet but firm. "It already had. You just didn't want to see it." The words hung between them, painful and undeniable. The confrontation was over, but the war within their marriage, the war for trust, for loyalty, for dignity, was only beginning. The night after the police left was the quietest night Elwayne had ever experienced inside his own house. The Branvels' departure had been thunderous. The slam of the door, the harsh scrape of Garrick's boots against the porch, Orlisse's clipped voice snapping at her husband as they retreated into the night. But once their car roared down the street, silence fell like a heavy shroud. The silence wasn't peace. It was the silence of an earthquake aftershock. Walls still trembling, objects teetering, air thick with the memory of destruction. Elwayne stood in the center of the living room, the deed still lying on the table like a flag planted in contested soil. His chest rose and fell, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through him. He had done it. He had held his ground, produced proof, claimed his home. For the first time in months he had been undeniable. But as he turned, his eyes found Lunara. She hadn't moved from the couch since the officers left. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale, her gaze fixed on the floor. Tears streaked her cheeks, though her face carried no expression. She looked hollow, a figure carved out of grief and confusion. "Lunara," Elwayne said quietly. She flinched, as though his voice startled her. Slowly she looked up, her eyes red and weary. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He blinked, stunned. Didn't have to do what? Defend myself? Defend us. Her lips trembled. Call them liars in front of everyone. Throw them out. They're my parents, Elwayne. The ache that had been simmering in his chest cracked wider. They called the police on me. They tried to have me arrested in my own house. And you're worried about them? Her tears spilled faster, but she didn't reply. For the first time, Elwayne felt truly alone inside the walls he had fought so hard to claim. The following days blurred, heavy with silence between them. They spoke only when necessary, about groceries, about bills, about mundane details of daily life. But the words carried no warmth. At night, Elwayne lay awake, listening to Lunara's soft breaths, wondering if she blamed him or herself, or both. He wondered if the rift was bridgeable, or if something had broken permanently when the flashing lights danced against their windows. Outside, the neighbors whispered. On Monday morning, as Elwayne stepped onto the porch to fetch the newspaper, Mrs. Harrow from across the street lingered on her driveway, eyes sharp with curiosity. She offered a thin smile, but it was laced with questions she didn't voice. 2 houses down, a man watering his lawn glanced up, his gaze flicking away quickly, as though embarrassed to have been caught staring. The police lights had been impossible to ignore. The Branvels' voices had carried into the street. Everyone knew something had happened, though the details were surely being twisted into countless versions by the grapevine. Elwayne clenched the newspaper tighter in his hand. Let them talk. He had nothing to prove to them. But inside, a quiet voice whispered, "You've already been judged, not by the truth but by the show." At work he found a strange sense of calm. The drafting table, the precise lines, the measured angles. They grounded him. His colleagues, unaware of the storm at home, treated him as they always had, respecting his skill and quiet authority. For a few hours each day, he could exist without the shadow of the Branvels looming over him. But when he returned home, the shadow was waiting. Lunara had grown distant, her smiles rare, her laughter extinguished. She moved through the house like a ghost, tidying aimlessly, avoiding his gaze. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, the silence grew unbearable. Elwayne set down his fork. "We need to talk." Her hands stilled, her eyes fixed on her plate. "About what?" "You know what," he said. "About them, about us, about where we go from here." Finally, she looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know, Elwayne. I don't know how to choose between you and them." His heart clenched. "It's not about choosing, Lunara. It's about right and wrong. They tried to destroy me in my own home, and you stood by and said nothing." Her voice broke. "They're my parents. I've known them my whole life. You don't understand what it's like to be torn like this." He leaned forward, his tone steady but firm. "No, you don't understand. This isn't about being torn. This is about respect. If you can't stand with me in my own home, then what do we have?" Her tears spilled over, and she pushed her chair back, fleeing the table. The slam of the bedroom door echoed through the house. Elwayne sat alone, the weight of solitude pressing harder than ever. And yet, despite the pain, something inside him was shifting. For the first time in months, he felt a quiet pride when he walked through the rooms. The Branvels' absence was palpable. The air lighter, the walls echoing only with his and Lunara's footsteps. The humiliation they had inflicted no longer defined him. He had stood his ground, and the house was his. One evening, he found himself back in the garden. The lavender sagged, weeds still thriving, but in the fading light, he saw possibility. He knelt, pulling at the stubborn weeds, his fingers sinking into the soil. Each tug was small, but each one was an act of reclamation. "This is mine," he whispered again, dirt under his nails, sweat on his brow. "This is mine." The words no longer felt fragile, they felt like truth. But victory carried shadows. The Branvels were silent, but silence was not surrender. Elwayne knew them too well. Garrick's pride wouldn't allow such humiliation to go unanswered. Orlisse's need for control wouldn't fade quietly. They would return in some form with some new tactic. And Lunara. She was slipping further away. One night, as they lay in the dark, she whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you for the way you spoke to them." His chest tightened. "Forgive me?" "For defending myself." Her voice was soft, almost inaudible. You don't understand the bond between parents and a daughter." He turned to face her, but she had already rolled away, her back to him. The silence stretched, heavier than ever. In that silence, Elwayne realized something profound. The battle wasn't just against Garrick and Orlisse. It wasn't even about the house. It was about himself. For too long, he had defined his worth by peace, by keeping harmony at any cost. But peace built on erasure wasn't peace. It was surrender. Now, standing in the aftermath, he saw it clearly. He could endure loneliness, whispers, even Lunara's distance. What he couldn't endure was losing himself. And for the first time, he knew he wouldn't. The fallout was painful. The marriage hung in a fragile balance. Neighbors gossiped. And the Branvels' silence loomed like a storm cloud. But beneath it all, Elwayne carried something he hadn't felt in months: dignity. He had stood in the fire and refused to burn away. And though the scars of the confrontation ran deep, they were proof of something unshakable, proof that he was no longer the man who swallowed his words and bowed his head. He was the man who stood, document in hand, and said, "This is mine." The days after the confrontation bled into one another, heavy with silence and tension. But beneath the stillness, something new stirred inside Elwayne Drelin, a flicker of resolve that refused to be extinguished. At first, it was subtle, a shift in posture. The way he walked through the house with straighter shoulders, his gaze no longer avoiding the corners where the Branvels once lingered. Each room no longer whispered their presence but echoed his own steadiness. The house felt different now. It wasn't just wood and brick. It was a battlefield where he had drawn a line and held it. Every wall carried the memory of that night when he had refused to be erased. And though Lunara's silence weighed on him, though the whispers of neighbors still pricked at his pride, Elwayne felt something solid beneath his feet at last. It was dignity. And dignity, once grasped, was impossible to release. It began in the backyard. The lavender plants had withered, weeds spreading like an invading army. The soil was dry, cracked, neglected under months of tension. For weeks, Elwayne had passed the garden without sparing it a glance, too consumed by battles inside the house to care about what lay outside. But one Saturday morning, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn, he stood at the edge of the garden and stared. Something inside him stirred. This was his land, his responsibility, his sanctuary. He rolled up his sleeves. For hours he worked. His hands sank into the soil, pulling weeds by their stubborn roots, sweat dripping down his back. The sun climbed higher, burning his skin, but he pressed on. The ache in his muscles was grounding, real, far removed from the intangible wounds of words and silence. When evening fell, the garden looked different. Not perfect, not yet, but better, clearer. The lavender still sagged, but patches of earth lay bare, ready for new planting. As he stood, surveying his work, a quiet smile tugged at his lips. For the first time in months, he felt accomplishment without bitterness attached. "This is mine," he murmured again. But this time, it wasn't defiance, it was hope. The garden was only the beginning. Inside, Elwayne began to reclaim daily life. He cooked meals again, not the rushed, flavorless dinners of survival, but careful, deliberate meals. He seasoned the chicken with rosemary from the small plant on the windowsill, roasted vegetables until their sweetness filled the kitchen. The aromas softened the house's tension, even if Lunara barely ate. He took long walks through the neighborhood, his strides steady, eyes meeting those who dared to look at him. At first, neighbors avoided his gaze, their expressions guarded. But gradually, a few began to nod, to murmur greetings. Respect, once lost, was not easily regained, but it could be rebuilt, stone by stone. At night, he returned to sketching. His drafting table once held only work blueprints, but now he spread blank sheets, letting his hand move freely. Not houses for clients, not structural lines dictated by contracts, just shapes, forms, ideas. He sketched wild towers that scraped the sky, bridges that arched over oceans, gardens sprawling across rooftops, dreams on paper, fragile, but alive. These sketches weren't for anyone else. They were his, reminders of the imagination he had buried beneath obligation and conflict. Yet, while Elwayne rebuilt himself, the chasm with Lunara grew. She watched his routines with quiet detachment. Sometimes she lingered at the doorway, arms folded, her expression unreadable, as he knelt in the garden or stirred a simmering pot on the stove. One evening she broke the silence. "You're different," she said softly. Elwayne looked up from his sketchpad. "Different how?" Her brow furrowed. "I don't know. Stronger, or maybe just harder." He considered her words carefully. "I've had to be. If I didn't change, I'd have disappeared." Her eyes glistened with unspoken conflict. "Sometimes I wonder if I've already lost you." The ache in his chest deepened, but he answered with quiet certainty. "You haven't lost me, Lunara, but I can't keep living erased." She turned away, her silence saying more than words. The whispers in the neighborhood did not vanish overnight, but change came slowly. One afternoon, as Elwayne worked in the front yard trimming hedges, Mr. Calloway from next door approached. He was a broad-shouldered man, usually brisk and reserved, but now he paused at the fence. "Heard things got heated the other night," he said cautiously. Elwayne straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "You could say that." Calloway studied him, then gave a curt nod. "Takes guts to stand your ground. Especially against family. Not everyone could have done it." It wasn't effusive, but it was respect. And respect, Elwayne realized, was worth more than gossip. Inside the house, there were rooms that carried the heaviest memories of the Branvels. The living room where Garrick had towered over him, the dining table where Orlisse had cut him down with honeyed cruelty. For weeks, Elwayne had avoided those spaces, retreating to his study or the bedroom. But one evening, he walked into the living room deliberately. He sat on the couch, leaning back, letting his eyes trace the walls. He remembered Garrick's voice booming, Orlisse's cold smile, but instead of flinching, he breathed deeply. "This is my home," he said aloud. The walls did not echo back their voices, they held only his own. It was late one night when the true turning point arrived. Elwayne had been sketching in the study, lines flowing across the page. When he paused and looked around the room, the lamp's glow pooled on the desk, casting shadows that reached across the walls. He thought of the man he had been months ago, quiet, accommodating, desperate to keep the peace at any cost. That man was gone. He had been burned away in the fire of confrontation, replaced by someone steadier, firmer, less afraid. Elwayne leaned back in his chair, the sketch pad open before him. Even if Lunara never forgave him, even if the Branvels returned with sharper claws, even if the community never fully embraced him, he would not give up this new self. He had found something too precious to lose. Dignity. And with dignity came resolve. The next morning he rose early, before dawn. He stepped into the backyard, the air cool, dew clinging to the grass. The horizon glowed faintly with the promise of sunrise. He knelt in the soil, planting new seeds where weeds once choked the ground. Lavender, yes, but also roses, lilies, marigolds. Flowers that would burst into color, proof that something once neglected could bloom again with care. As the sun crested the horizon, bathing the garden in golden light, Elwayne felt a surge of clarity. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about growth. He would build a life not defined by others, control, not shadowed by whispers or silences, but shaped by his own hands. No matter what storms came, he would stand. And when the flowers bloomed, they would not only mark the soil as his, they would mark him as reborn. For weeks after the police escorted Garrick and Orlisse out of his house, Elwayne lived in a fragile, uncertain calm. The silence of their absence was sharp, but manageable. Each day he worked in the garden, cooked meals, sketched late into the night. Each day he felt himself grow steadier. But peace, he knew, was never going to last. The Branvels were not people who surrendered. They were people who waited, recalibrated, returned with sharper claws. And one autumn afternoon, they did. It began with a letter. The envelope lay on the doormat when Elwayne returned home from work, its thick paper embossed with a lawyer's insignia. His stomach tightened as he tore it open. Inside was a neatly typed notice, an official-sounding demand claiming that Garrick and Orlisse had contributed financially to the house and therefore held an equitable interest in it. The letter stopped short of legal action, but its threat was clear. surrender influence, or prepare for battle. Elwayne sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. His name was on the deed. His ownership was undisputed. But the Branvels weren't fighting with truth anymore. They were fighting with perception, with pressure, with the endless drain of conflict. When Lunara walked in and saw the letter, her face paled. "Oh no," she whispered, taking it from him. Her eyes scanned the lines, her breath quickening. They wouldn't really take this to court, would they?" Elwayne's jaw tightened. "If it means regaining control, absolutely." Her hands shook. "Elwayne, please, don't make this worse." The words stung more than the letter. "Don't make it worse? They're the ones escalating. And you're worried about me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't reply. The Branvels didn't stop at letters. Within a week, whispers began to resurface, this time sharper, more pointed. At the market, Elwayne overheard two women murmuring by the fruit stand. Poor Lunara, trapped in that house. Her parents tried to help, he had them thrown out. Their voices dipped as they noticed him, their pitying glances slicing deeper than outright insults. Elwayne clenched his fists but kept walking. Later, Mr. Calloway, who had once offered a word of respect, avoided his gaze. Respect was fragile, rumor was poison. At home, Lunara grew more distant. Some nights, she would leave her phone face down on the counter, only to snatch it up quickly when a message buzzed. Elwayne didn't need to ask who was on the other end. The Branvels were tightening their grip, not through direct force this time, but through Lunara, through the community, through carefully seeded doubt. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, a car pulled into the driveway. Elwayne was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, when he heard the engine shut off. He stepped to the window and froze. It was them. Garrick, stepping out with his imposing bulk, Orlisse following with her immaculate poise. The sight sent a chill crawling down Elwayne's spine. He had thought the deed and the police had ended their intrusions. Clearly, he had underestimated their persistence. He opened the door before they could knock, blocking the entrance. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat. Orlisse's smile was soft, almost maternal. "Elwayne, please, we're not here to fight. We only want to talk." "Talk?" His laugh was bitter. "The last time you came here, you called the police on me." "That was a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with practiced warmth. "We acted out of concern. You must see that." Garrick stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We're not your enemies, Drelin. But you can't keep Lunara isolated from her family. That isn't right." Elwayne's voice hardened. "She's not isolated. She lives here. She's free to see you whenever she wants. You just don't get to own her, or this house." From behind him, a voice trembled. "Elwayne." He turned. Lunara stood in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes darting between her husband and her parents. "Let them in," she whispered. The words cut deeper than any threat Garrick could have made. Reluctantly, Elwayne stepped aside. The Branvels entered as though they'd never left, their presence instantly shifting the air. They sat in the living room, Orlisse crossing her legs gracefully, Garrick planting himself heavily into a chair. Lunara perched nervously on the couch, while Elwayne remained standing, unwilling to give ground. "We're worried about you, darling," Orlisse began, her tone dripping with concern. "We hear stories in the neighborhood. People saying you're unhappy, that you're trapped." Lunara's eyes widened. "That's not," she hesitated, faltering under her mother's gaze. Elwayne felt his jaw clench. "You spread those stories." Orlisse ignored him. "We only want what's best for you, Lunara. We want to see you safe. If that means taking steps to protect you, we will." The implication was clear. Protect her. From him. Elwayne's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Enough. You've manipulated, lied, and now you're poisoning her against me. But I won't play your game." Garrick leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "You can't stop us, Drelin. Blood is stronger than paper deeds, stronger than you." The words struck like a challenge, but Elwayne did not flinch. He stood tall, his voice steady. "Blood may be strong, but dignity is stronger, and you will not take mine." The Branvels left that night, their smiles brittle, their threats cloaked in civility. But Elwayne knew this was only the beginning. They had shifted their battlefield, from deeds and police to whispers and loyalty. They would try to turn Lunara completely, to break his resolve not by force, but by eroding him from within. And though fear pricked at the edges of his resolve, Elwayne felt something else rise stronger. Determination. He had survived their storm before. He would survive it again. And this time, he would not only endure, he would win. The Branvel's return had poisoned the air of the Drelin household. For days after their manipulative visit, Elwayne could feel their words lingering in the walls, seeping into every conversation with Lunara. She grew more withdrawn, her eyes shadowed by conflict. Sometimes she defended him in small ways, but more often she faltered, her silence betraying her uncertainty. Elwayne could see the battle raging inside her, and he knew Garrick and Orlisse were fueling it from afar. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke again. And it came on a Sunday evening. Elwayne had just finished setting dinner on the table when the doorbell rang. He froze. The sound was sharp, insistent, carrying a weight he instantly recognized. When he opened the door, his stomach dropped. Garrick and Orlisse stood there, dressed impeccably, their faces composed, and behind them, to his disbelief, several neighbors lingered on the porch. Mr. Calloway, Mrs. Harrow, and others from down the street. "We thought it best to address this openly," Orlisse said smoothly, her voice carrying the poise of a practiced hostess. "There's been so much confusion. We'd like to clear the air." Elwayne's jaw tightened. This wasn't a visit, it was a performance, a public trial in his own home. Before he could speak, Lunara appeared behind him, her face pale. "Elwayne, I asked them to come." Her words hit harder than any blow. She had invited them in. The group moved into the living room, filling the space with uneasy chatter. Garrick took the armchair as if it were a throne, Orlisse settling gracefully beside him. The neighbors perched awkwardly, their eyes flicking between hosts and husband. Elwayne remained standing, his hands at his sides, his heart pounding with the weight of betrayal. Garrick began, "We've all seen tension in this household. We've heard stories. And as parents, and as members of this community, we feel it's our duty to ensure Lunara is safe, respected, and happy." Murmurs rippled among the neighbors. Mrs. Harrow nodded faintly. Orlisse leaned forward, her voice sweet. "Elwayne, we don't want conflict, but surely you must see the harm this environment has caused. The isolation, the strain. Wouldn't it be better, for everyone, if you stepped back?" It was a master stroke of manipulation, not an attack but a plea, framed not as domination but as concern. All eyes turned to Elwayne. For a moment the weight of it pressed down on him. The neighbors' whispers, Lunara's silence, the Branvel's poised cruelty. But then something steadied inside him. He remembered the garden, blooming again under his care, the nights he spent sketching, the pride in every reclaimed room. The moment he had held the deed before the officers, his voice unshaken. This was his house, his life, his dignity, and no one, not Garrick, not Orlisse, not even the doubts in Lunara's heart, would strip it away again. He drew a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the room like iron. "Enough." The chatter stilled. Even Garrick's imposing frame seemed to falter under the word. "You've come into my home," Elwayne continued, his tone steady, unwavering. "You've lied, manipulated, poisoned. You called the police on me, tried to erase me, tried to twist my wife against me. And now you bring my neighbors here, turning my house into your stage." His eyes swept the room, locking onto each person in turn. "But the truth is simple. This is my home. My name is on the deed. My hands built the life within these walls. And I will not surrender it to anyone's pride or gossip." Orlisse's smile flickered, but she held it in place. "Elwayne, please. No one doubts your contributions. We only—" "No," he cut in, his voice sharper now. "You don't get to dress this in concern. You've made it clear from the beginning. This was never about care. It was about control. And I won't live under it. Not anymore." Garrick shifted in his chair, bristling. "You dare." "I dare because I must," Elwayne said, his voice rising, strong enough to shake the silence. "For too long I kept quiet. I bowed my head, swallowed your insults, let you plant doubt in my marriage. But that ends tonight." He turned to the neighbors, their faces caught between discomfort and curiosity. "You've heard their whispers. You've seen the police lights. But you haven't seen the truth. The truth is that I've fought every day to build a life here, a life they've tried to tear down. And I will not be erased. Not in this house, not in this neighborhood, not in my own heart." The room was silent. Even the Branvels had no ready reply. Finally, Elwayne turned to Lunara. His voice softened, but carried the same strength. "You have a choice, Lunara, to stand with truth, or to let their lies define us. But I will not beg anymore. I will not fight shadows while you stay silent. I will stand, with or without you, because I know who I am." Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. She looked between her husband and her parents, torn to the core. Orlisse rose, her composure cracking. "Come with us, Lunara. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to stay with a man who defies your family." Garrick added, his voice a growl, "Choose blood, or lose everything." But for once, their words didn't dominate the room. Elwayne stood taller, his presence unshakable. His silence after their threats was louder than any argument. The Branvels, for all their poise, looked small against him now. Their manipulation hung in the air, but it no longer had teeth. Because he had taken back the power they fed on. After a long silence, Orlisse huffed, gathering her purse. Garrick rose, muttering under his breath. Without another word, they strode out, the neighbors shuffling awkwardly after them, their expressions uncertain but changed. The door closed, and the house fell still. Elwayne remained where he stood, his breath steady, his resolve unshaken. He had faced them all, family, community, whispers, lies, and he had not bowed. It was not victory in the traditional sense. Lunara still wept quietly on the couch, her decision unspoken. The future of their marriage remained uncertain. But in that moment, Elwayne Drelin knew this truth with absolute clarity. He was no longer a man erased. He was a man who stood. The house was quiet after the door closed behind the Branvels and the murmuring neighbors. For the first time in months, there were no raised voices, no threats cloaked in civility, no heavy boots crossing the threshold uninvited, just silence. Elwayne stood in the center of the living room, his chest rising and falling slowly. The echo of his own words still lingered in the air, stronger than any of the accusations that had filled the house before. It was over. At least, the battle with them was. Lunara sat on the couch, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She hadn't spoken since her parents left. She hadn't moved either. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know what to say." Elwayne looked at her, his expression steady. For years, he would have rushed to comfort her, to explain himself, to beg for understanding, but not anymore. "You don't have to say anything," he replied softly. "Not tonight." Her gaze lifted to meet his, searching, as though she were seeing him for the first time. Not the man her parents had painted with venom, not the shadow she had doubted, but the man who had stood unshaken in the face of their storm. Later that night, after Lunara went to bed in silence, Elwayne stepped into the garden. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of autumn leaves. The flowers he had tended swayed gently, the soil still dark from his care. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in the calm. This garden had been his refuge, his quiet proof that life could grow even after destruction. Tonight, it felt different, not just a place of survival, but of triumph. He thought back to the moment when Garrick had bellowed at him, when Orlisse had tried to reduce him to nothing with her polite cruelty, when neighbors had whispered behind his back, and he thought of how he had answered, not with fists, not with surrender, but with truth. It was enough, more than enough. The days that followed were uncertain but lighter. The neighbors avoided eye contact at first, but slowly their whispers faded. Some offered polite nods. A few even seemed to carry a trace of respect. They had seen something that night they hadn't expected, a man who refused to bow. The Branvels did not return. Not with letters, not with rumors, not with sudden appearances. Whether out of shame or exhaustion, or the simple realization that their power over Elwayne had crumbled, they stayed away. And Lunara, she moved carefully, as if caught between two worlds. Some mornings she sat with Elwayne in the garden, silent but present. Other times he caught her staring into the distance, her thoughts locked away. Elwayne didn't press her. He had made his stand. The rest was hers to decide. One evening as they shared dinner in silence, Lunara finally spoke. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I can untangle everything my parents put in my head. I don't know if I can unhear their voices." Elwayne set down his fork, meeting her gaze calmly. "You don't have to know right now. All I ask is that you see me clearly, not through them, just me." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded but said nothing more. It wasn't a resolution of their marriage, not yet, but it was a step. That night, as Elwayne sat at his desk sketching, he realized something profound. This story, his story, wasn't about the Branvels, or even about Lunara. It was about him, about the quiet strength he had rediscovered, about the man who had been buried under doubt and manipulation, and who had clawed his way back into the light. The Branvels had tried to erase him. They had called the police, poisoned the community, turned his wife against him. But through it all, he had endured. He had stood. And in the end, he had won, not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them destroy him. That victory could never be taken away. In the weeks that followed, Elwayne found peace in small things. Morning coffee on the porch, the creak of the wooden floors he refused to resent, the quiet hum of the house that was fully, undeniably his. The world outside might never fully understand what he had faced, but he didn't need their understanding. He only needed his truth. And his truth was this: no matter who tried to silence him, no matter who tried to strip him of worth, no matter who claimed power over what was his, he would not be erased. Because a man's dignity does not live in the whispers of others, it lives in his choice to stand. Elwayne Drelin had chosen to stand. And in that choice, he had reclaimed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.